Hi, everyone, and welcome through Treks Through Time. I am your host and FreightWaves Deputy Editor, Brielle Jaekel, and I'm here to tell you about some of the most interesting stories throughout history in transportation and freight. Today, we're covering a sad story about the crash of a Navy airship called the USS Akron, where numerous men lost their lives, and it was the first of two major airship crashes in New Jersey during a time when some believed airships were really going to be the future of travel. And both of these incidents actually are a little close to home for me personally by sheer coincidence. And so today I am joined by Dr. Caroline Johnson, who works with the Naval History and Heritage Command, and she does a great job of telling us the story. So let's just get into that now. Hi, everyone. I am here with Caroline Johnson, who is a historian at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C., and we are talking about the USS Akron today, which is interesting because I find it interesting because it's one of two major blimp crashes in not only in the U.S., but specific to New Jersey, where I live. I live on the Jersey Shore, which is right around both of the Hindenburg crash and the USS Akron. And so we want to talk to Caroline. We want to hear what you have to say, like what you can tell us about the USS Akron first, like in general, what it was for. I know that you have a lot of experience with it. You've done a lot of work with the USS Akron, or, in terms of history. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about that project?
Absolutely. So I'm from Ohio, actually. So this is a little close to my heart. So obviously built at, we pronounce it Akron. It's apple, it's oranges, tomato. So
I knew
I
it
might
was
say
Akron. I knew the
so
town
excuse
is
me.
Akron. I just wasn't, I guess.
Right. So this was actually named by SecNav Charles Francis Adams after the town in which it was created. So Akron, Ohio, which is near the Goodyear plant. So it's a helium-filled rigid airship of the U.S. Navy, and it to this day holds the record for being the largest helium-filled airship. So you might hear it referred to as ZRS-4, which is just its serial number or identifier number. But ultimately, we know it as the USS Akron. And some important dates, it was really kind of conceived in October of 1929. This was when manufacturing began. It was launched, which just means it was floating free in the massive hangar that was created for it in August of 31. And then it was officially commissioned on Navy Day, so October 27th in 1931. So it's about 2-year production timeline for it to actually be built because this thing is massive. It is 785 feet. So it's just shy by about 19 feet of the Hindenburg, which most people, and I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit, know as one of the largest airships. Hindenburg was 804. So it's just shy of the size of the Hindenburg. And ultimately, Rear Admiral William Moffett, who was the first chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics for the Navy, is the one who gains the golden rivet into the airship in November of 31, setting it ready for sail.
So how long was it in commission for? And then, yeah, tell us about the crash.
Sure. So it is officially commissioned in October of 31 and ultimately meets its end in April of 1933. So it's not even 2 years that this is in commission.
Wow.
Right, which is a really short time frame when you think of the lives that, fixed wing aircrafts have today, about a year
Yeah.
and a half. But the crash. So there's actually a few incidents leading up to this major incident that some historians view as a bit of a foreboding or a forewarning. So first, in February of 1932, pardon me if I'm recalling dates off the top of my head, she's caught by the wind and ultimately strikes the tail fin. So this injures kind of the lower fin area of the Akron. And this is a problem because this was at NAS Lakehurst, so Naval Air Station Lakehurst in Jersey. And they had brought a bunch of kind of congressional politicians and whatnot to view this incredible airship. And what happens is it strikes its lower fin area, which does not look good as a PR stunt for the politicians who are ultimately funding these projects, right? So that's strike number one. Strike number two is a little bit more tragic and sad. And this occurs, we have to remember, this airship is actually traveling thousands of miles throughout its commissioning time. And it takes off from NAS Lakehurst in Jersey on May 8th, I believe, and it travels en route all the way to California. So when we're thinking of a helium-filled airship, that's a long way for it to travel. It actually goes a southern route, kind of down through modern-day Louisiana, Texas, through Arizona, out to San Diego. And it's going to moor at Camp Kearney. Unfortunately, it's used to NAS Lakehurst, where they have trained ground handlers and specialized mooring equipment for this massive airship. The landing proved to be a bit sad and difficult as a result of not having this equipment. So the airship, by the time it gets to California, is uncontrollably light. We think of a helium balloon, right? And how it rises immediately. But you add warmer air out in California, and you add the fact that it's burned fuel en route, and now it's extremely light. So it's hard to get it to its mooring equipment to the ground. There is mooring crew trying to hold the ropes down to keep it down to prevent it from doing kind of a nosedive stand on itself on this mooring equipment. Ultimately, the choice is to release these ropes because the airship, it's impossible to keep it down. You have 4 men that hold on to these ropes. Right. One gets about 15 feet in the air, makes the snap decision of not a good move, releases, and only suffers a broken arm, elbow as a result. 3, however, are still holding on to their ropes as they're brought into the air. 2, unfortunately, do lose their grips, and it is caught on camera to this day of them falling to their deaths at that time. So loss of the lives of 2 sailors. I actually do have their names here. We have aviation carpenter's mate 3rd class Robert H. Edsall and apprentice seaman Nigel M. Henton. So I like to just mark their names as a tribute to those sailors. The third, though, who was named apprentice seaman C.M. Bud Cowart, clung onto this rope for an hour, until he was hoisted inside the airship, ultimately.
Oh, my God.
So this is a kind of an incident that not many, if any, people know about predating the crash of the Akron. That was kind of an incident that triggered, this could be really dangerous, even just in mooring the aircraft or something you thought was a standard procedure. There was one more incident where the tail fin strikes again.
Oh, no.
No issue. So we have 3 incidents leading up to the crash. Now, I like a good story. Are you a storyteller by nature?
Absolutely. That's why I do this.
I love it. Me too. So in terms of the crash, I kind of like to tell it in story format to live out what these sailors were going through in real time. So if you can picture native New Jerseyan, it's an April evening, so April 3rd, and we are taking off from NAS Lakehurst. So this is kind of where its main station is in New Jersey. It's its 73rd flight, so it's been on many flights by this time, and it's accumulated about 1,500, 1,500 hours of flight time. So if the airship was a person applying for the airlines today, they would be highly qualified to do that. 1,500 hours is kind of the standard you need to apply for an airline. So it's well suited to flight. It's done the job several times. And by all intents and purposes, this is a standard operating flight. The goal of this particular flight, though, was to operate along the coast of New England and primarily to assist in the calibration of radio direction finder stations. So kind of a standard operation procedure, maybe not as high altitude as it would normally be for scouting incidents, but a little lower to the ground to assist with this calibration. Of the 76 souls on board, there are a few notable figures, particularly for the Navy. So the first one of importance is Rear Admiral William A. Moffett, who, as I mentioned a little earlier, is the first chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics for the Navy, and a massive proponent of lighter-than-air aircraft, airships in general. So he's excited to kind of show this off. His aide is also there, Commander Henry Barton Cecil, as well as the commanding officer of Naval Air Station Lakehurst, whose name is Fred T. Berry. So they have some prominent people on board the ship at the time, and they're taken off to calibrate some radio stations. Soon after departure, though, they encounter a fog. And this fog is from about 300 to 1,500 feet. There's open, smooth air after 1,500 feet, and then there's another blanket of clouds that's developing around 5,000 to 6,000 feet. So the Akron chooses to hover right around 1,600, so just above that layer of fog, but close enough to the ground that it can actually peek through when there are clearings to be able to assist with this radio calibration. So Commander McCord, who had taken over from Alger Dressel of commanding the airship, the USS Akron, sets the course westward. So you're taking out of New Jersey and then geographic orienting ourselves. They're heading west toward Philadelphia. And this is mainly just to get better visibility, to try to get away from the fog that they think is ultimately being caused by the ocean, warm air drafts, you name it. So they set the course westward, and their ultimate goal is to follow the Delaware River down toward the Capes. The weather starts to deteriorate pretty rapidly, and they see lightning appearing south. If you're familiar with the Delaware River, it empties out into the Delaware Bay, and they see it around Wilmington area. Lightning is getting worse. So the captain chooses to speed up engines and ultimately escape eastward. So we've tried going west. Now we're going to try going back east.
Okay.
To escape these weather threats. Little pause for, our anachronistic timing. Hindsight's 2020. Mm-hmm. Unbeknownst to the crew at the time, they're dealing with one of the worst storm cells in the last decade. So they're trying to outrun it, but the conditions are swelling, the storm cell swelling all around them. There's not really an opportunity to get away from it, at least from their vantage point. By the time it passes Barnegat Light, so are you familiar with Long Beach Island in New Jersey?
I'm going to blow your mind. That is where I live.
Oh my gosh. I used to vacation there as a kid every summer.
Okay, we'll have to talk after this.
Not many people are familiar with Long Beach Island. I say that and they think Long Beach, not the same.
The story of my life. But
yeah,
this is Barnegat Light.
You have the Barnegat Light. Yeah. So if you're watching this in real time, you can see that's actually Barnegat Light. And this is what the crew passes around 10 p.m. And at this point, the weather has just gotten so much worse. And 2 hours after that, so now we're talking just after midnight, about 12:15, the fog has fully enveloped them. It's heavy rain and lightning is all around them. In this incredibly unstable atmospheric environment, the USS Akron ultimately begins a nosedive descent, and it's still falling at 1,100 feet.
So just from wind and rain?
They think ultimately, and we can kind of talk about the findings after, but ultimately they think it's a downdraft. Okay. There also is some speculation that there was inaccurate altimeter ratings. So this is what tells the commander the altitude at the time, due to not really realizing the decrease in barometric pressure from the storm. So they're not fully sure what the full reasoning was, but ultimately downdraft is listed, at least in the naval proceedings, naval court, as the cause of this sharp. There is a precaution taken here. It's not unknown to lose altitude in an unstable atmospheric environment. So for those familiar with, obviously we're on FreightWaves. There's something called ballast that is used. And in this case, it's water. And it's simply a weight that's carried aboard for the Akron, a lighter than air aircraft that's used to offset that buoyancy. So helium will cause the ship to rise. The ballast, the water, will keep that kind of an even altitude. At this point, they want to gain altitude. So Lieutenant Commander Wiley drops the water first from the midship containers and then the bow emergency blast, because they're dropping altitude fast. They're too close to the ground. They've got to gain altitude. And ultimately dumps about 1,600 pounds of water into massive sprays.
Wow.
this works. So it does what it's supposed to do. And keep in mind, while they're performing this action, they are still losing altitude. So the ship is descending, but it stabilizes at around 700 feet from the sea level. So we're close, but we have some altitude. And ultimately, it regains about 900 feet of altitude to level out at 1,600 feet. So just above that initial fog layer again, but they're surrounded at this point.
Well, I find this interesting because it's the exact opposite problem that they had in San Diego, where they couldn't keep it down.
Exactly. And this is a history of airships. And at this point, Akron was seen in many ways to have kind of addressed this issue. Part of having a helium-filled airship is, once you get rid of the ballast, is there any way to kind of help regain altitude once you've gotten rid of the water? They did include condensers on the Akron, which was a way to take kind of water vapor from the outside and regenerate that water ballast. However, we're talking a matter of minutes, right? So there's no way that they can regenerate enough to help dump it again and regain altitude. So this is incredibly unfortunate because ultimately it's not enough. The Akron does begin a second violent descent. This time it's tail down, and it's at the rate of about 14 feet a second. So we do the math, which I got you, 1,600 feet, and we're dropping at the rate, 14 feet a second. So we're talking about 114 seconds. So under 2 minutes until it hits sea level, which you can imagine as a cruiser, you're descending. You've got less than 2 minutes. They don't know it at the time, but I mean, I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of what that would feel like, to be descending that rapidly and to have already dumped your ballast. And so you don't really have many options at this point. So what happens ultimately is that the lower or the aft fin hits the water first. And as an aviation geek, I find this really interesting because most people picture an airship crash as just plopping in the water and that's it.
Yeah.
And being dragged under. What we forget, in terms of ships, at least, these are massive and they can often take a long time to sink under. In the case of the Akron, this tail hits first and it starts filling with water. But we do have 8 Naval engines on the Akron generating thrust. So usually when you're in straight and level flight, that's going to pull you forward. If your tail is stuck in the water, however, it's going to actually send you up. That thrust is going to pull you up, which puts the airship into a nose-high attitude, which is a kiss of death in aviation as a pilot. It puts you into a stall. And the only correction for a stall is nose-down power, but you're already tail in the water. You have no altitude to correct it. So this kind of is what seals the Akron's fate. Tail hits, starts filling with water, stall, down in, disintegrating, starts getting pulled under in really stormy seas, mind you, in the dark Atlantic Ocean after midnight.
With at this point, it's been, 3 minutes?
Right. Correct. I mean, this all happens in a matter of minutes. And something that's interesting is we do have an account from the German ship Phoebus at around 12:24. This is kind of how we can time things, because we'll get to in a second. There was only 3 survivors that are all kind of in the control room at the time. And they do make it out. They're kind of thrust out into the water. But the German ship Phoebus sees lights descending rapidly at around 12:24 a.m., so just after midnight. And ultimately, they turn around to come check out what's happening. They thought it was an airplane crash, like a fixed-wing heavy aircraft. They didn't know this was one of the largest airships in history that had just hit the water. They actually pull Lieutenant Commander Wiley out of the water, as well as second mate Richard Deal and aviation metalsmith Moody Irwin. I had to remember. Sorry.
I can't believe you can remember all these names so well.
Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I need Post-its, but today. So they pull 3 out of the water, and they actually don't even know it is the Akron that crashed until Lieutenant Commander Wiley comes to. He had kind of fainted, passed out, and he informs them that was the entire crew of the Akron that had just landed in the water. So the Phoebus combs the ocean for about 5 hours. So from just after midnight until 5:30 a.m. And they're actually joined by Navy blimp J3 that assists in these recovery efforts. But keep in mind, we're still in storm conditions. We're still in the dark. It's between midnight, 5 a.m. So ultimately, the Navy blimp actually loses 2 lives as well, trying to assist in these recovery efforts. Right. The first American vessel, which was the USS Tucker, doesn't actually make it on the scene until about 6 a.m. So now we're on April 4th, 6 a.m. And even though we had several ships assisting in these recovery efforts, including the Navy J3 blimp, ultimately, it was a total of 73 of the 76 lives lost. When you add the 2 from the Navy blimp, that is a total of 75 fatalities with this incident.
That's so sad.
It's tragic. It's absolutely a tragic loss of life. And during the interview after, Lieutenant Commander Wiley, it's online, so please go Google this. It gave me chills when I first watched it. I did write down this quote here. So he actually says, "We were in the water about 45 minutes, and now we are ready for duty in airships or wherever we may be assigned." That's his first words, is that we're ready for duty.
Wow.
Even after experiencing this tragedy.
I can't imagine what it would be like to, one, just go through all of that in general. And I know now the water is still in the 50s around here, and I'm where it crashed. I can't even get waist high in the water right now. I can't imagine being in that, if surviving that in April.
Right. And you hit the nail on the head. It's ultimately drowning. So not having anything to hold on to in stormy seas, and also hypothermia that ultimately causes those 73 fatalities of the men in the water. So there is precautions taken as a result of this. I don't know if you want to talk about kind of like what comes of this, or what happens and how it goes.
Yeah. So actually, my next question was going to be, what is the aftermath? What kind of came about, during the investigation? Did they, I know the Hindenburg crashed like 5 years afterwards. So obviously they didn't stop using air ships. But yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what happens afterwards?
Absolutely. So there's kind of a few gut reactions that the public, the Navy, politicians all have surrounding this incident. And the first is dealing with the tragedy itself and making sure this doesn't happen again. This is kind of a pride point for not only advocates of lighter than air airships for the Navy in general, but just for the United States kind of operations of airships, mainly because this was one of America's largest and strongest aerial creations at this point. It could carry over 207 passengers on 10-hour journeys. It really was touted as kind of the potential future of aviation, not only for civilian use, but military use as well.
Right.
And ultimately, this is the largest loss of life in any airship crash, which we can talk about Hindenburg and why those are seen differently in a second. But in debriefing the incident, 2 major issues really come into play. One was there were no life jackets on board. So I know we mentioned drowning and hypothermia as the 2 main causes. A big reason for that is there were no life jackets. So as a result of this incident, Akron had a sister ship called the USS Macon, equivalent in size, and they outfit the Macon with life jackets, which proves incredibly useful because just a few years later in 1935, the Macon encounters a similar fate, a crash, but this time off the coast of California. But the difference here is we do have different conditions, warmer waters, etc., but 70 of the 72 crew survive. So big difference between 73 out of 75 perishing and 70 out of 72 living.
Wow.
That is life vests. Also access to rafts as well. So there weren't enough rafts on board the Akron, or Akron. I'm saying it now.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. I've heard it a million ways. So there weren't enough rafts on board, and they didn't have time to deploy them anyways in those conditions. But there were rafts added onto the Naked. So those two factors, life jackets and rafts, really contributed to saving lives in future incidents. Now it's
That's
huge.
great. Yeah.
Right. It makes it much more less of a sad story. But there are, as you mentioned, kind of political and legal ramifications as well. So the Navy Court of Inquiry ultimately finds there could have been a few issues here. First, they did decide that the commanding officer could have committed an error in judgment in not setting appropriate courses given the weather conditions. Also, there's mention of potential inaccurate altimeter readings, which might not have been the commander's fault, but something to consider. They do ultimately name a downdraft as the main cause for the sharp descent of the Akron twice. Unstable atmosphere, no real ability to change that. They were unable, though, to kind of place this responsibility of a failure to kind of check the descent, just given the amount of time in which the fall took place. Essentially, commander didn't have enough time, did the best that they could with the actions, did dump the ballast the first descent. So those appropriate actions were taken. Ultimately, no, the CNO, or Chief of Naval Operations, decides that some of this evidence is inconsistent with each other. We just can't really decide what happened. And so ultimately, he judges in the favor of the commanding officer and dubs it a tragedy caused by a downdraft weather, unable to fix conditions. This, though, really does impact kind of how the Navy and technology in general moves forward. So the immediate reaction actually is somewhat divided, but it did still push for airship innovation. There was real pushback that, airships had come so far and they fought this uphill battle and they deserved their day and not being condemned by this tragic incident that was ultimately not dubbed anyone's fault, right? So people actually recommended building a replacement of the Akron and naming it in honor of Admiral Moffett, who perished in this accident. And they even went so far as to recommend that foregoing airship construction would be a disgrace to those who lost their lives in this incident. So it's kind of easy to think, oh, this would be a clear indication to not proceed with building airships, using airships, but you also have those voices and those reasons saying why they should continue.
Well, thank you so much for giving such a telling story. We love hearing, the ins and outs of these things, and it's absolutely tragic, but it is, great to know that good things maybe we learned from it, and that we're able to save lives in the future.
Absolutely. Definitely. Thank you for having me. It's always a joy to kind of nerd out and tell stories that people don't always know or appreciate. So thank you so much, Brielle. It's been truly a joy.
This is the exact same reason I started this podcast, so I could just nerd out on these stories and be able to tell stories and have fun. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I will end it with a fun fact. As always, on this day in history, the Arlington Cemetery was established when 200 acres of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's estate in Virginia was seized by the U.S. government in 1864, and it was authorized for its use as the famous cemetery that we know today. You can follow me on Twitter at Jaekel Brielle to see what else we have going on at FreightWaves Classics. And you can email me at bjaekel@freightwaves.com and tune in 2 weeks for our next episode on FreightWaves TV, or listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts.